we're going to get started. I'd like to introduce Mr. Joshua Cole, who's going to be talking on PJSIP today. Just as a note, I'm sure most of you are aware, but this will be an hour-long talk. It'll cover 2 sessions. So, anyway, Josh, take it away.
Like Kevin said, hi, I'm Joshua C. Culp. I'm a senior software developer for Sangoma. You can call me Josh, though. You may also know me as File on IRC, in the Asterisk and Asterisk Dev channels, as well as other places, or J. Culp on the Asterisk Community Forum and the Free PBX Forum. So for those who are unaware, both projects do have community forums. So Asterisk is community.asterisk.org. Free PBX is community.freepbx.org, and they are great resources if you're encountering a problem and really need help or would like to help each other out. It's kind of, for Asterisk, it's been the natural progression away from the mailing lists. So check that out. I'm also available on Twitter at JoshNet, so if you'd like to follow me, feel free. If you'd like to reach out, discuss stuff, don't hesitate to. Just be aware you will see posts about VoIP, software development, and also dogs and stuff like that. I'm also a 15-plus year Asterisk developer. I've been around quite a few years, so I've seen Asterisk go from a 1.0 release all the way up to 17 now, so I've seen it gain testing, stability, processes, all that kind of stuff to really get Asterisk to where it is today, and helped with that as well. But I'm also the original co-developer of the PJSIP support in Asterisk. So I did it alongside Mark Michelson, you might remember, no longer with us at Sangoma, but his code lives on in Asterisk. So I helped decide what the architecture was going to look like, what the configuration was going to look like, that kind of stuff. So really helped to make PJSIP what it is today. But I've also created many other things, the most recent being the addition of multi-stream support to the Asterisk core, which I hope none of you really noticed in the end, because that's the way it was supposed to be. It's in the core, but it didn't impact you at all. But now for the main event. Can I get a drum roll, please? ChanSIP is now marked as deprecated. Please don't throw anything out at me. Don't panic. It's still in the tree and enabled as of Asterisk 17. The only difference is, yes, Alistair, go for it.
Move your mouse pointer, please.
Good point. Let's see if it still works. Yay! Thanks, Google. So yeah, it's still in the tree and enabled. So if you download Asterisk 17 and build it, it'll still be there. It'll still load. The only difference is, after Asterisk is actually started, on the console, it'll tell you that ChanSIP is deprecated, and you should make plans to move to PJSIP. And it'll provide the wiki links to help you with that. So what this deprecation means. Chan PJSIP has reached maturity for the vast majority of users. There are still cases where ChanSIP has functionality that PJSIP doesn't. 2 examples being advice of charge, which is an RFC that defines a way in SIP to communicate how much a call is going to charge or cost at the beginning, and then at the end it can also give you the actual total of that. How many people have used AOC in ChanSIP? So we got 2 people. Which is kind of why it's not done in PJSIP. I'm sorry. The other one being call completion supplementary services, which is a way in SIP of subscribing so that when a person gets off the phone, you know about that, like from a remote perspective, not a local perspective. How many people have heard or used CCSS? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, a few. Maybe I should be specific. How many have used the CCSS support within Asterisk in ChanSIP? We're down to 2. So this is kind of why that stuff hasn't really been approached yet in PJSIP. That's not saying it couldn't be done in the future, it's just not there now. And based on our own survey and stuff that we've done and talking to people, those just haven't really been things that have caught on and been used. So we really recommend moving to it for new installs and also working to migrate your existing. So come up with a plan, do testing, figure out what for your deployment that actually looks like. Now, As I've said, PJSIP isn't gone yet. However, the discussion to entirely remove it, and that's a discussion, it's not a certainty, but it could very well be removed, will occur in no later than 4 years from now. So we haven't removed it from out under you, but 4 years from now, that may happen. So be aware of that. So what can you do? Work on migrating now, not in 4 years. And we ourselves for SwitchVox did this actually in February of 2016. So as of the move from SwitchVox 5 to SwitchVox 6, underneath the hood, that was an Asterisk upgrade and also a complete migration to Chan PJSIP. Chan SIP is not even built or used at all in SwitchVox. No one really noticed the change, but we did it. And it gained some new functionality and features as well. Now, let's talk about PJSIP. PJSIP, it's an open source project. It's available at pjsip.org. So if you are creating an open source project or you're doing a commercial product, in that case you would need to talk to the maintainer, which is Tello. You can go download it, you can use it, you can see what it's like. It's first released in February of 2005. So it's been around quite a long time, over 14 years now. And it's gained really widespread adoption because of the wide platform availability. So you can use it on Linux, Windows, OS X, iOS, Android, even embedded processors in phones. Through that, it's gained a lot of testing because it's out there in tons of stuff. That stuff is testing against lots of other SIP implementations. So yeah, it's popular with Android soft phones and also physical hard phones. So chances are you've actually used PJSIP from a phone perspective without really realizing it. Whoops. We use PJSIP differently though, because Asterisk is fundamentally not a phone. It's a server, and that carries different ways of doing things in different scenarios where you have higher load and higher usage, for example. So really fundamentally, we treat it as a low-level SIP stack. It handles the nitty-gritty of SIP. So dialogues, transactions, packet retransmissions, all the really low-level stuff of actually doing that. That being said, we still do use some of the higher-level features of it. So 2 examples being PubSub and outbound registration. When we were initially doing the PJSIP support, we looked at what PJSIP provided, and we looked at what we would do if we were to implement the same thing, and whether that would be beneficial to us. In the end, for PubSub and outbound registration and a few other things, it didn't really make sense for us to rewrite all of that logic because we would have done the same thing. So we used the higher level things when it actually makes sense. So, and this is something we actually go back and revisit as we run into things with that functionality to see whether it really makes sense yet again for us to implement our own thing. And so far, it hasn't. So that allows us to focus on building features on top of it. And features can be user features, so things to make the lives of users easier, but it can also mean the other aspects of doing certain things. A great example being a call. A call in SIP is only one part of it. It's an invite, some SDP stuff, all of that. Within Asterisk, there's lots of other stuff you have to do for that. You have to apply any configuration. You have to figure out who it is. You have to set up the Asterisk channel. You have to set all the information on that. You have to send it into the dial plan. So when I say features, I also mean that kind of stuff. Through doing that, there are cases where we've needed to extend or improve PJSIP. So as a project, and this includes Sangoma people, and it also includes community members, we're also contributors back to PJSIP itself. So recent versions of PJSIP have code from both Sangoma, community people, and we've contributed that back up, so it's also beneficial to the other users of PJSIP. Fun fact, the first release of Asterisk, including PJSIP support, was the first release of 12 in December of 2013. So PJSIP support has been in Asterisk for quite a few years now. It's gained stability, we've improved it, we've added features. So it's come a long way. and I would, like this presentation is entirely about, I would highly suggest working now to migrate over. So some things we've contributed. Pluggable DNS support. DNS is important in SIP. We don't all speak IP addresses. So the DNS support included with PJSIP is a nice base level of support. It provides SRV records, A records. As of recent versions, it'll also do quad A records for IPv6. But we wanted to go beyond that. We wanted to add additional functionality like NAPTR and load balancing and that kind of stuff. So we looked at what PJSIP provided and whether extending that was the right solution for us as a project. Through extending PJSIP, that would have probably solved some of our problems, but it wouldn't have helped Asterisk itself. So we opted to make a core DNS API, which provides all of this functionality, so we can use it in other places in Asterisk, but also leverage that in PJSIP. However, PJSIP had no ability for us in a clean fashion to replace their DNS support with our own. So we came up with a backwards compatible way that we could contribute up to PJSIP to plug our logic in. So that was something we actually contributed back and can actually be used by other projects because other users of PJSIP experience the same thing with NAPTR support and failover. So numerous crash fixes and transport-related fixes. Like I said, Asterisk is different. It's a server. A phone, realistically, for TLS and TCP connections, might have 1, 2, or 3 connections at a time. Asterisk might have 200, 300, 400, or more. So that really stresses things in a different way than actual phones. So through doing so, we uncovered some bugs in PJSIP in those scenarios and others, and so we contributed those back up. Because fundamentally, we don't want to be a fork. We don't want to have to maintain our own version of PJSIP, divergent at all, so we want to contribute everything possible that we can. There are a few patches that stick around in Asterisk, but those are strictly build related. So those are to disable things with PJSIP that we don't use or need, or to provide a Asterisk specific configuration for when PJSIP is built. So PJSIP is actually part of a larger project called PJ Project. And PJ Project has a lot of stuff in it that we don't use. An example being PJ Media, which is a complete media stack if you want to build a phone. It does RTP, RTCP, it has codec implementations, it has a jitter buffer, it has conferencing, both audio and video. It does a ton. But for Asterisk, we use the same media stack as ChanceSIP. So the only thing we've really changed of that is that the media stack has gained new functionality for WebRTC, and that's only currently leveraged by PJSIP. So like I said, we don't use their DNS. We plug in our own, and we don't use PJSUA. How many people have heard of PJSUA or actually used it? A few. PJSUA is a really, really high-level library for building a phone. So, like I said, Asterisk isn't a phone. It doesn't make sense. And by high level, I mean it really simplifies the concepts of building a phone, such that doing a call is can be one action, one command. Putting them on hold is one thing. Well, if you're doing it at a lower level, that involves setting up a re-invite, changing the SDP, that kind of stuff. So PJSUA takes care of that. Chances are you've used PJSUA too. Because it's so easy, a lot of the soft phones and hard phones and etc. end up using that. So the Asterisk PJSIP approach. How many people have looked at PJSIP support in Asterisk, seen all the modules, and gone, whoa, that's a lot of modules? I got a few. So it's to be as modular as reasonable and possible, and to be as pluggable as reasonable and possible. So we don't want to cram everything into a single 31,000 line file of C code. So we spread it out. That has a few benefits. One being we're consumers of all the APIs internally that we are providing to developers to actually extend PJSIP. It's also nice because there is that separation of where stuff lives that can make it easier to find where functionality needs to be changed or added by developers, which is nice. Don't reinvent the wheel. This includes implementation and terminology. So implementation, if PJSIP provides something and it's reasonable for us to use it, not reinvented, we'll go for it. Terminology, we don't have users, friends, or peers. We opt for things that are defined within RFCs, be it SIP or others, industry terms, technology terms. So we have endpoints, we have AORs, which are an actual SIP, address of record concept. As well, we take a fundamentally different approach to the configuration. How many people have configured ChanSIP such that they've put an invalid value in a field, done a reload, and haven't really noticed that something's gone wrong? It just kind of did it in the background for you. I got 2, I got 3. Chances are you've all experienced that, but you might not have known it. ChanSIP takes a different approach in that if you provide an invalid value, it generally replaces it with the default value and spits out sometimes a warning on the CLI. But if you're not looking, you're not going to notice it. So in the end, the configuration may not do what you actually wanted or expected it to do. PJSIP and generally modules going forward go for an explicit configuration with sensible defaults. So if you specify a configuration option with a value and it's invalid, it won't allow that specific configuration section to actually load. And that's because by you configuring something, there was intent. You wanted us to do something, but we don't know what to do with that. So as to not leave the system in some kind of state that you didn't expect, we prevent that. We put out a warning on the actual Asterisk console. And then if you try to use it, it's not going to be there, which is a good sign to you that something has gone wrong. So if you ever do that in PJSIP, for example, you configure an endpoint and it's not there, always look at the Asterisk console, because we will output something, and if it's a .conf file, we'll tell you the file and the line number. And then sensible defaults, we opt for defaults, which the vast majority of users would actually use. So PJSIP installation. In the beginning with PJSIP and Asterisk, we added support and contributed it back up to build PJSIP in a shared library configuration. However, in practice, we found that users had trouble building PJSIP in the way that was really needed for Asterisk. The result of which was that sometimes you get absolutely bizarre crashes or things wouldn't really make sense. So a Sangoma employee called Joseph contributed something called bundled. And really what bundled is Asterisk downloading a copy of PJSIP, and it's the same copy of PJSIP that you yourself can go and get from pjsip.org. We just host a copy on GitHub because they have a better content delivery network. And then applies any unreleased PJSIP fixes. So that allows us to not be tied to the PJSIP release cycle. So if our users are experiencing a problem, we can pull that patch in and integrate it immediately instead of having to wait for a new PJSIP release. This is a configuration or a configure option for 13, but it's automatically done for 16 and above. As well, this builds PJSIP in a configuration which is best for Asterisk. By default, PJSIP will use a configuration which is good for phones. So like I said, has a different working environment. So yeah, not all PJSIP builds are equal as it can be customized. A build for a phone is not equivalent to a build for a server. Going back to TCP and TLS, the default configuration is optimized for a phone, so few TCP and TLS connections. But Asterisk being a server needs more than that. There's also a developer flag, which defaults to on, that will cause PJSIP to assert or crash during certain scenarios. We build without that for users, which will cause PJSIP to generally just continue running along and gracefully handle that. In a developer case, you generally do want it to crash so you can explore what happened at the situation, what happened, so you can then go see if there's an actual problem. But for users, just carrying on is the better option. So a controversial subject, asterisk configuration. However, before we get to PJSIP, let's talk about sorcery. Just as it's an honor, a fun fact, if you ever see the name of something in asterisk and it's slightly creative in any way, that generally came from me. I opt for names of things which are fun to involve in conversation. Sorcery being one of them. So sorcery is our unified data layer for configuration and data storage. Data storage being the persistence of data. So a good example being an inbound SIP registration. We want to persist those out, so if you restart Asterisk, you don't lose all of your inbound registrations. And this is an API that going forward, where reasonable, new modules will use because it has pluggable backends for different storage methods. So that would be AskDB, .com files, real-time, and a cool one that I'll show after this. Used by modern modules. For users, it enforces documentation on developers. So if a developer adds an option to something that's using sorcery, a developer has to document that option. There's no way to get away from that because the code enforces that. If you add that option, you don't document it, the option won't exist yet. And we use that documentation in different ways. So we use it on the console, and we also use it on the Asterisk Wiki, which we'll talk about here soon. And for developers, it's not just enforcing documentation is hard on developers a bit, but there are good things that a developer gets out of it. One of them being a simplified API to all those backends, as well as some guarantees, such as that things that come from sorcery are guaranteed never to change. So as a developer, that makes it easier to use because you don't have to lock and protect. You don't have to figure out if something has changed and you need to update a part of it or stuff like that. So it's nice. Sorcery caching is the really fun part from a user perspective. How many people have used RT Cache Friends in ChanSIP? So you got a David Duffett, a few. For those who are unfamiliar, that allows you to connect ChanSIP to a database and then in memory keep that information from the database so you don't have to go back and query the database. Unfortunately, RT Cache Friends in ChanSIP isn't very flexible, so you don't have much configuration with it. Sorcery caching, on the other hand, is very, very flexible. So it's highly configurable, it keeps things in memory. It's great for use with real-time, and in fact, SwitchFox itself uses this to reduce the impact on the database on the system. You can configure your caching on a per-object basis, so some things may frequently change, some things may rarely change, so you can allow different configuration for that. The options include how many things you want to keep in memory, how long you want to consider them valid for before querying the actual database or backend. Another nice thing is stale functionality. Without staleness, when an object goes out of date and you have to query, then anything requesting that has to wait for that update to occur. With staleness, sorcery caching will return the potentially out-of-date thing to whatever is needing it, and then in the background, asynchronously do the update. So whatever needs that object isn't blocked or waiting. It can also be controlled using AMI and CLI. A great example is a web UI. So if a user has updated something in the web UI, you can use this mechanism to actually expire something specifically instead of having to say everything is no longer valid, wipe it all away. Full backend caching is cool as well. Normally, if you don't use full backend caching and something wants to get a complete list of everything, you can't use the cache because it may not reflect the backend completely. Stuff may be in the cache, stuff may not. Full backend caching puts everything in the cache. So operations that say, show me everything, can use the cache instead of querying the backend. So this is really flexible in what you can do. Now we get to PJSIP configuration. Uses the previously mentioned sorcery, so you can use sorcery caching with it. Types, endpoint, AOR, industry or technology terms. Supports real-time and flat file configuration thanks to sorcery. Also thanks to sorcery, you can't create invalid things with the configuration. As well, how many people have connected ChanSIP to a database, done a SIP show peers, seen nothing, and gone, what is going on? So a few. Sorcery guarantees that no matter the backend, the interface is the same and the behavior is the same. So the CLI reflects reality no matter the source. So if you connect it strictly to real-time and you do PJSIP show endpoints, it'll show you the endpoints, even though they're all in the backend, or in real-time. So configuration types. Endpoint configuration when talking to another SIP device. SIP device can mean another Asterisk, an ITSP, a phone, a gateway, basically anything that speaks SIP. An AOR, address of record, holds inbound registrations. An identify, it identifies incoming traffic based on certain criteria, so IP address-based matching, header-based matching. Auth, an inbound or outbound authentication credentials. And then a registration, as you might expect, an outbound registration. So let's take a gander. An example PJSIP endpoint. Anyone who's ever looked at a SIP RFC probably knows who Alice is. So this is defining an endpoint. It's allowing only the ULOG codec. If anyone has never seen that exclamation point all before, that basically turns that part into a disallow. So this is functionally equivalent to disallow equals all, allow equals ULOG. Using this just allows you to eliminate that line if you like. And then any calls from Alice goes to the user's context. An outbound registration. How many people in ChanSIP have ever tried to decipher a register line to figure out what it's actually doing and what each part is? So a few people. For PJSIP, we opted not to try to cram everything into a single register line, but we actually defined an outbound registration section. So server URI is how you contact that server. This would do a DNS lookup on test.com, do NAPT or SRV as appropriate. Client URI would be who you are registering to, or the AOR you're registering to. And then contacted user is equivalent to the / section at the end of a ChanSIP register line. And this sets the user portion of the contact that we provide the registrar of how to reach us. This may or may not get used in practice. It really depends upon the relationship that you have with the server that you're registering to. Many, if they see you as a phone, will preserve this information. In other cases, if you have a different relationship, for example, you have multiple DIDs, they may choose to ignore this and instead send your call to the DID instead. If this is not specified, it will default to S, just like ChanSIP. Authentication, so this defines a username and password-based authentication. This authentication mechanism is pluggable to a degree within PJSIP. So in the future, if additional authentication methods come into existence that we need to implement, it's not a difficult thing to do. So it is expandable. So what if you want it simpler? PJSIP fundamental configuration has a lot of sections that go together to actually give you a full configuration. So we have something that builds on top of that called config wizards. How many people have heard of config wizards before for PJSIP? We got a few. So it defines a single section that you provide configuration in, and then behind the scenes it will transparently create all of those objects for you. So you don't actually know or care that they're being created on your behalf. The result being you don't need to create them yourself. And then using templates, you can even reduce the size of the configuration files further. How many people know of configuration templates? Yay, more. I'll talk about those here in a bit because they're very, very handy and they do apply to Asterisk in general. This is all stored in a separate configuration file called pjsip_wizard.conf. So if you want to take a gander there, you will see them. Here's an example of a phone. So this defines a wizard, accepts registrations. So these are from the perspective of Asterisk. Asterisk is accepting an inbound registration from the phone. Accepts auth is the same. We are going to challenge and accept incoming authentication from the phone. Inbound auth defines the authentication to use with the phone, and then the endpoint is for the actual calling part. So this, in the background, will create an AOR, an auth section, and an endpoint, but you don't know that. One of the nice things about Wizard is that there are cases where you may want to override specific configuration fields on specific parts of it, so you can do that, and that's what's happening here. Endpoint/allow means that the allow part of the created endpoint is being set. So it still does give you some flexibility if you do need to touch those individual parts without having to go back to a full list of all the individual sections yourself. An ITSP is slightly different. So sends auth means that we are expecting the ITSP to challenge for authentication and for us to send it to them. Sends registrations means that we are going to be creating an outbound registration and actually register to them. Remote hosts is the host names that we're expecting to use for the ITSP. Outbound auth configures the outbound authentication. And then endpoint context configures the context for incoming calls from the ITSP. So this creates a few more. It will create an auth section so we can authenticate. It'll create an outbound registration. It'll create an identify section so we can do IP-based matching. It'll also create an endpoint so we can handle incoming calls. But like I said, you don't really have to care about that part. You can just define the wizard and it'll take care of the rest. Now, there is a SIP.conf converter in Asterisk if you'd like to take an existing SIP.conf file and move it over to PJSIP.conf. It has been tested with different configurations, but I'm positive there are creative ways you can write SIP.conf that will probably confuse it in some way. So what I personally recommend is using it as a learning, as a way to learn what an equivalent PJSIP.conf would actually look like. So you should be, generally most people have a general sense of what SIP.conf is like and what their configuration is actually doing. So converting it over, you can see what actually happened and figure out what a PJSIP.conf equivalent is actually like. I would not recommend just doing this without taking the time to understand what was created, because if you then need to make changes, you could convert a SIP.conf again, but it might not work. And you don't really want to move forward without some understanding of PJSIP configuration. So documentation is on the wiki. How many people have looked at the PJSIP documentation on the wiki? Yay! That makes me happy. So there's tons of documentation on there. We have documentation on example wizard and non-wizard configuration files, how to configure NAT for PJSIP, WebRTC, tons of stuff. As well, all of the configuration options are also documented on the wiki. And this is thanks to that requirement that documentation be provided when an option is added to sorcery. Each night, a process goes through, it takes that documentation out of Asterisk, and then puts it on the wiki for easy lookup there. So if a developer contributes something that adds a new configuration option, the day after it's merged into Asterisk, it'll just automatically appear on the wiki. So here's some common configuration questions that I actually get. Why so many configuration objects? We really wanted to start with a configuration that was flexible for PJSIP. So we could build things like PJSIP wizards on top of it, because going the opposite direction of taking something simple and trying to extend it and add more functionality as people wanted stuff was, well, it's not the easiest thing to do. So why no general section? Simplifies implementation and it leverages the existing functionality of configuration templates, which are actually more flexible in what they can do. And then why do the configuration parameter names have underscores? Because generally with older modules, everything's just sort of crammed together in a single name instead of separating individual portions with underscores. And this actually allows us to do automatic naming for AMI and CLI. So a developer doesn't have to worry about remembering to add new configuration options to all those various commands. It can just be automatically done. In the past, with other modules, we've actually encountered situations where it was forgotten, and then we have to later add it in, and then it may have still been forgotten in another part. So thanks to this, it just automatically happens. So for example, media underscore encryption becomes media encryption with the uppercase M and the uppercase E, to signify the individual words. So configuration templates, the answer to lack of general section inheritance. This is also usable pretty much essentially wherever you have a .conf file. You can use this actual pattern. So this defines a template called template-name, and inside of it, there's a field called setting, which is set to value. And this is creating an object called object, which inherits from template-name. And in practice, what this will do is that when the configuration parser looks at this, it will see that object has setting equal value and setting to equals value. So if you have a lot of common things that you're sharing between configuration sections, you can stick it all in a template and then reference that in each individual thing. You can also override. So if template-name had setting to equal value to, then the configuration parser would see setting equals value, setting to equals value, not setting to equals value to. So if there are specific sections that just need to override one thing, you can do that if you wish. So this can be a good way to clean up your configuration files. ChanSIP threading. I won't go deep into threading, but I will just say this. ChanSIP has one thread for all UDP traffic. If that is blocked, so for example, a DNS lookup or a database query, then all the UDP traffic is blocked. If that goes on long enough, then it can even exceed the network buffer on the system itself. So that can be problematic. How many people have experienced this before? That's less than I was expecting. PJSIP is different. It still does have a thread which handles UDP, TCP, and TLS. However, it also has a pool of threads that incoming messages are given to actually process. And this is done in a programmatic way so that developers don't have to worry about receiving or handling of messages out of order, which is quite nice for developers. This pool is configurable, so you can say, I want to always have 10 threads available. You can also configure it to grow and shrink based on load. It really depends upon the deployment itself, what makes sense. So PJSIP modules, like I said, there's a ton. Res PJSIP binds Asterisk to PJSIP. PJSIP session handles all the call and SDP level operations. Chan PJSIP handles the translation between the Asterisk world and the PJSIP world. So if it's told to, hey, send ringing out to this channel, it'll do the translation into a 180 ringing in SIP land. And then PJSIP SDP RTP handles the RTP aspect of SDP. We've made that pluggable to a degree, so in the future we could potentially add other media types if need be. Endpoint identification. All traffic that comes into a PJSIP is related to an endpoint. And this is good because it ensures that in code you always have an endpoint to reference. It means that you don't have to copy configuration for every call, because sorcery ensures that things never change. So you can just grab a reference to the configuration and use it. So less memory usage. The way it works is incoming traffic is given to endpoint identifiers, which is just bits of code that then look at the message and figure out if it can determine who the endpoint is. The order isn't fixed. It's configurable in the global section of pjsip.conf. So unlike ChanSIP, if you want to prefer IP-based matching ahead of time, like first, for user-based, you can configure it to do that. I know that some people with ChanSIP have experienced a case where caller ID has caused a user entry to get matched, and then their call is challenged for authentication and the call fails. So you can change the order in PJSIP to prevent that. And it's also pluggable, which is quite nice for developers and also for an upcoming feature that I'll talk about. So inbound registration, also done in another module, in an actual registrar. It manages that process, enforces a configuration that's defined on the AOR, so that's how many contacts, expiration time, and that kind of stuff. And it also uses sorcery to persist that out. In the case of the registrar, by default, that just uses ASDB, just like ChanSIP. So from a user perspective, it just works. Presence, done in Res PJSIP PubSub, handles subscribe, notify. However, it does not handle what we know as hints or extension state. That's actually done by another module because, as with many things in PJSIP, that's completely pluggable. A nice feature that it has over ChanSIP is that for some subscription types, the one that does not work currently is dialog-info plus XML because it has additional state associated with it that's not yet supported. But the other ones, when Asterisk starts up, it will just recreate those subscriptions. So a phone doesn't have to resubscribe to Asterisk to start receiving notify updates, which is quite nice. So let's look at some things that PJSIP has that ChanSIP doesn't. Music on hold pass-through. So normally when a phone says, hey, put this other person on hold, Asterisk is the source of that hold music. In PJSIP, there's an option called music on hold pass-through, which instead will send a re-invite for hold and unhold as appropriate to whatever Asterisk is connected to. And it then becomes the responsibility of the upstream, be it a PBX or a provider, to actually provide the music on hold. SRV and NAPTR load balancing and failover. So, like I said, we have our own DNS implementation we use for PJSIP. This has gained us a lot of stuff. One of the differences that Chan PJSIP has over ChanSIP is that DNS resolution occurs when a SIP request is sent. The result is generally not stored except in any external DNS cache that may exist. So in ChanSIP, when you load your configuration, as part of that process, it goes and resolves that host name that you've provided. PJSIP doesn't do that. Like I said, when it's actually needed to be used, then it'll resolve it at that time. Load balancing will occur based on the result of the DNS lookup. So a DNS lookup essentially results in a list of potential IP addresses and ports that we can send our SIP traffic to. So we can, if one fails, for example, we can't connect, certain responses are received, then we'll just go down the list as we need, rather. Both A and Quad A records are supported. We do have a preference for Quad A. And our DNS resolver is also intelligent in a way in that it will not do queries that just won't work. An example being, if you don't have IPv6 enabled as a way to communicate in PJSIP, it's not going to do any PJSIP DNS lookup, or it will not do any IPv6 DNS lookups. Same goes for TCP, TLS, UDP. Line support. How many people have heard of line support and outbound registrations in PJSIP? Ugh. Only Sean? That's unfortunate. I bring this up as a nice feature quite often in places, including the community forum, community.asterisk.org. So the way this works is when an outbound registration is sent, it creates a randomly generated token to add to that outbound registration. And it does this by setting a parameter in the contact header that we provide to the registrar. The registrar is supposed to preserve this information and send it to us when it sends us calls. In practice, this can be dependent upon the SIP implementation and configuration of the remote side. So this is something you really have to test. But on an incoming invite, if the token is there, we can establish a relationship between the call and the outbound registration. In the outbound registration, you can configure an endpoint that is used for incoming calls. What this really means is you don't need to add IP-based matching configuration to PJSIP if the remote side supports this, because it can just see the tokens there, match it to the outbound registration, and the endpoint's there. Media stream support, New World, WebRTC video. So thanks to the SDP negotiator, generator, and parser in PJSIP, multiple streams can be negotiated in SDP. And this was really nice in that as a user of PJSIP, a developer user of PJSIP, the only thing we had to do to really support this was look at the result of that and figure out from an Asterisk perspective what has to be done. So streams can be added, removed, modified as needed by Asterisk applications. From an application perspective, it's quite easy. You just say, I want this channel to have these streams of these codecs of these properties. PJSIP takes care of the rest, sends out a reinvite, looks at the result of that, and applies it. And this is really what was used for the WebRTC SFU video support. So if you haven't checked out the WebRTC SFU video support, I'd highly suggest looking at the Asterisk blog as well, blogs.asterisk.org. We've done quite a lot of blog posts about it, and there's also tons of other good blog posts there covering various things. It's multiple IP matching of inbound traffic. How many people have had to configure tons of SIP peers in SIP.conf to match incoming traffic from an ITSP or a provider? Not too bad. So Chan PJSIP takes a different approach to that. It has an identify section, just a single section. You can configure multiple IP addresses. They can also be discovered. And by discovered, I mean it'll do an SRV lookup and try to determine all the possibilities based on that. If that fails, then it'll fall back to A records and quad A. If for some reason you don't want to use the SRV functionality, that is also optional. There is an option to turn it off. You can also do subnet masks. So if your ITSP has an entire /24 that they use for calling, you can configure that in a single line. And the nice thing is it's a single identify section, and it also all goes back to a single endpoint. So you don't need to configure multiple endpoints. Multiple contacts on AOR. So unlike Chan SIP, in PJSIP you can configure it to allow multiple registrations to a single AOR. So that will share endpoint authentication and AOR. They can all be called at once. However, something that I've heard people ask about is, how do I individually call a device? And that's not actually possible with this. And that's because there is no uniquely identifying information to say, hey, this is my mobile phone, this is my desk phone, because it's all sharing the same information. So I really recommend this as an option for when it's a single individual who has multiple devices and not multiple devices spread out across different people. Because generally in that case, you would be calling the person instead of an individual device. So now is the time to move. Please don't put this off until 4 years from now. Put together a plan now, test it out. If you have problems, we do want to hear about it. Our issue tracker is issues.asterisk.org. As well, if you're having configuration issues, don't hesitate to use the Asterisk community forum, community.asterisk.org, and post there. It's quite active. I'm seemingly always there, so chances are I might respond to you. But yeah, make the move now if you can. Questions, comments, or suggestions?
What would it take to get advice of charge added?
What would it take to get advice of charge added? How do I answer that? Interest from a community member or one of the Sangoma team members, essentially, to actually take that on. There just hasn't really been that much demand for it.
So you mentioned configuration on the wiki, not configuration, but it is updated from the source code periodically every night. A few months ago, we noticed that it was being updated from the developer version, so the links commit would be there. It was very confusing to us because we were using the links stable, but the features described there weren't available yet. Why do you get from the developer version instead of latest stable?
That's because the process that extracts the wiki documentation pulls it from the Asterisk, the version branch and not the latest version. So it can differ. I can see about changing that so that it becomes more in sync with the latest release, so that that difference doesn't exist. I'll add myself a note right now, actually. Reminder.
Other than that, what are you working on?
What are we working on? Do you mean from a PJSIP perspective? That's a good question. We're continuing to fix bugs as they come up, of course. We haven't yet planned out fully what will be happening in the future. From a PJSIP perspective, I don't know what's next really for me or the team. We'll see. It depends upon what essentially the way I look at this is that I look at what a large majority of users are experiencing as problems or areas where we can add features to improve things or tweak things here and there, and then I'll usually bring those up as something to work on. Yeah, but if you are running into specific things, like I said, don't hesitate to let us know and we'll see what we can do. Alistair.
Is there a way for an external application such as an ARI or AGI program to create an arbitrary SIP packet and send it out? For example, a custom notify?
That's not currently supported. However, due to the architecture of PJSIP within Asterisk, it would not be a substantial thing to do, which, yay for architecting things.
Any other questions?
You're on a roll.
Does the multiple AOC support get confused or gracefully handle badly behaved customer-side map that keeps changing the source port?
The answer is it can. The way it would work is that so if you configure a fixed number such as 10 contacts on an AOR, there is another option called remove existing, which will essentially remove however many is needed to ensure that a new registration is added. And it does this based on the age. So if it's a re-registration of an existing contact, but the information has changed, then I think in practice, it would still, the end result would still be what you'd expect, if that makes sense, because of the actual age being taken into account when removing. But NAT is fun.
Any other questions? No? I got a quick question. As far as moving from ChanSIP to PJSIP, maybe talk a little bit about, just quickly, we don't have a lot of time, but if people are using real time, what kind of utilities are there in Asterisk for PJSIP and real time and all that?
Tori, are you still here?
Yeah.
Didn't you extend the SIP.conf converter to cover real time?
Yes.
So, Tori, stand up, say hi. Tori is one of the community members who has contributed to PJSIP and helped add functionality that his business has needed in order to move over to PJSIP. He also extended the SIP.conf converter that I mentioned to also cover real time. So it'll actually do the conversion there as well if you'd like to. If you'd like to start fresh, then Alembic is the utility we use to manage the schemas and stuff. So you can use that to create a fresh table and then manually add things in if you'd like. As always, I do recommend, like I've said, not using the converter and just using the result, but do try to understand what's going on.
Okay, one more question, this now for the audience, I suppose. I guess for a show of hands, how many people are currently using ChanSIP exclusively?
That's not too bad.
And for PJSIP, PJSIP exclusively? All right, and lastly, something in between, maybe both or, yeah.
So I have a question for the both category. Why is it both? Go over there.
I was able to put one of the clients on it without a problem, smaller place.
Oh, okay.
And everybody freaked out when I did the second one because there was some weird inter-department calls that being joined that shouldn't. And I ended up basically being told, go back. And so I've still been waiting on trying to do that. But I did have success with one, but the other one, there was some odd issues. And they didn't want to give me time to figure it out.
Okay. So that was actual separate deployments, not like
Yeah.
ChanSIP and PJSIP on the same system.
Right, different,
Okay.
yeah.
I was just going to say that those of us who have been using Asterisk for a long time, when we found a configuration, a version of the configuration that works and did not crash, you stuck with that, and that's kind of where half of my code is today. So don't fix any broken.
Just a reminder though, 4 years it might be removed.
What's that?
I said just a reminder, 4 years it may be removed.
All right, I don't got any more questions. Thank you, Josh, for that riveting talk on PGA Hall. All right, thank you, everyone. I believe there's a break right after this.
Yep. Yeah, thank you.
I was about to show you 10 minutes, and I was like, oh, wait.
My name, Angelo.
Oh, dynamic. Yes.
Is that coming to PJSIP? That's a really bad idea to do that, but
I have ideas on it, on doing it a considerably better way than ChanSIP did.
what?
I have ideas on how to do it in a considerably better way. I just haven't gotten to it yet. Which is essentially being able to define an endpoint within the dial plan so you can configure any aspect of it, including authentication, like individual fields, all that stuff.
So what I have is I have a system where I update variables in real time based on a phone system, based on a in and out. I don't want to constantly add peers and constantly reloads and distribute systems. I just have a cron job that variables and comes into memory. It matches this and uses it has the password in memory and uses variables. So it's not defined endpoints, which I'm trying to get away from actually updating configurations.
Reloads are considerably better in PJSIP. Like, considerably better than ChanSIP. It won't block the universe while it's doing a reload, like in ChanSIP.
Well, most of the time you do a reload, maybe it's because of just Asterisk in general. Well, bring shit that you're doing.
That's a ChanSIPism, due to the way that configuration reloading is intertwined with like core parts of of ChanSIP. So it kind of has to lock the universe of ChanSIP, which kind of ripples out to the core as well. Yeah, it's considerably better in PJSIP for reloads. Go for it.